Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the final stretch. I'm really excited about our next speaker because she has a front row view of the world's events, because she takes her viewers through the biggest geopolitical events of the world every night. Let's take a quick look.
It's 9 o'clock. I'm live in Jerusalem after a week that could transform the Middle East. Tonight on a special edition of The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Israel strikes back, launching an attack on Iranian soil, targeting a province with nuclear research facilities.
Here she is, Yalda Hakim. She's curious, she's fearless. Welcome to Interlaken. So you take viewers literally around the world every single night, but I want to talk about this very moment. That was roughly a month ago. That's when we thought the world was on the brink of a war between Israel and Iran. And luckily, we've pulled back from that brink. But now we still don't have any solution when it comes to Gaza and Israel. We're looking at a peace proposal from Israel and the US, but nothing's happened. Last night, a school in Gaza was bombarded. Are you confident that we will see a resolution at some point?
You know, Caroline, when that strike happened, we'd been debating whether Iran would hit Israel following what happened on April the 14th at a diplomatic compound where it was believed that some Iranian Quds Force commanders and one of the most senior Quds Force commander was killed in a targeted strike by Israel. What I found extraordinary about that moment was both sides needed to strike at each other for it to be diffused. Normally we prevent, or the world wants to see a prevention of strikes so that things don't escalate. They needed to be almost a tit for tat for it to end.
And luckily that was enough. One tit for tat, it didn't go any further.
Because it was a dangerous moment, right? And yet what we're seeing in Gaza today, which is one of the main reasons why we saw that escalation between Iran and Israel, and that's what we've been seeing for the past not just the last 8 months. I mean, we know the proxies that Iran has had and what Israel has also been doing to the Palestinians long before October 7. But October 7, we saw the devastation take place, and now we've got 36,000 plus Palestinians dead, over 100,000 dead, injured, or missing. Do I think there is going to be a solution? Well, this is a debate that the world has had for 75 years. Increasingly, I'm hearing more that rather than a two-state solution, there is discussions around a one-state solution, that whether Israel needs to come to terms with the fact that it might remain the only Jewish state on the planet, but it will need to absorb and take in the Palestinians as citizens who have equal rights in that country. It's an ongoing discussion and a devastating one to see in real time.
Absolutely, it is heartbreaking, but I think what struck all of us really, and us as journalists, is how polarizing this debate has been and covering this war and this conflict, and also how it's played out politically. Biden is losing ground with the young voters because of his stance and his continued support for Israel. We're seeing protests across US campuses, even here in Switzerland. Is this the most polarized conflict yet?
What I also think is extraordinary is we may not see a change in leadership in Gaza. We might not see a change in leadership in Israel. But we might see a change in leadership in the United States as a result of what happens in the Middle East.
Do you really think that would be one of the key reasons why you would lose?
I mean, it is, when you look at the polls, it is one of the main reasons why young voters, especially the ones at universities, are turning away from Biden. Yeah. They are citing the war in the Middle East. You know, I find it extraordinary that the war in Ukraine had great economic impact globally, right? The economic impacts of what was going on in Ukraine after COVID impacted all of us. The war in the Middle East doesn't have an economic impact, but it has a huge social impact. So, you know, that's why I do think what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. You know, the old adage, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Ultimately, it comes back to haunt the United States. In 2017, Trump Trump administration put a doctrine together, its national security strategy, and it said great power competition now is the biggest issue for us. Rivalry with China is the biggest issue for us. The war on terror is yesterday's war. What's going on in the Middle East is not something we need to think about. And yet today, the administration, the United States, Europe, the West have been dragged back into the Middle East because that issue hasn't been resolved.
Absolutely, and it has massive ramifications on the oil price too, and if that rises further, although right now we're seeing the geopolitical premium in the oil price is actually surprisingly pretty low, but it's exactly because the conflict has been contained, but that can have an adverse impact on his chances for re-election as well. But I want to come back to the reporting on Gaza and Israel, because I was talking to a mutual colleague of ours. He used to work with me at CNBC, and I met him in London the other day, and he said to me, "Carolyn, you're so lucky to work in business news." I said, "Yeah, it's the greatest job on the planet." And he said to me, "You just report it as it is. You say a stock goes up or down, profits are up or down." But now that he also works at Sky News, and now that he reports on Gaza and Israel, he's received so many threats, serious threats, because seemingly he took a side with one side. Do you feel the same way? Is it impossible to report on this?
Caroline, in the one breath, on the one day, on the same day, I might be interviewing two different people from either side of the spectrum, and I get described as a Zionist and an anti-Semite in the one breath. I mean, how can I possibly be both? You know, it is because there's an attempt by us to report accurately on issues, and it might not be favored by either side. No matter what you do with this conflict, you've got it wrong. No matter what you do, you're taking a side. And I think even if we are clearly trying to report the facts on an issue, the truth itself is questioned. And so it just makes it incredibly difficult. I myself have faced numerous threats, death threats, threats against my family, personal threats against me, because one side or the other is not happy with me portraying an issue around this very war. And it is something that happens every time. You know, what I find when we have younger producers in the newsroom, and when it's their first Israel-Gaza or Israel-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East, they're so emotional. You know, they almost turn from journalists into activists, and they say, "But I can't believe this and I can't believe that." For me, it's sort of perhaps my sixth or seventh war when it has come to this particular conflict.
So you have to take out the emotion. Also, when dealing with these kind of threats, again, death threats, is that something that you have to live with? How do you deal with that?
I don't look at comments on my social media.
That's a good idea.
I don't read the posts. I don't read the good or the bad. When I was a very young green producer and then reporter, a very senior famous anchor said to me, back in those days, there was no social media, and I'm perhaps showing my age now, but it was the beginning of my career, and we used to have letters sent from viewers, and I used to read all the letters and separate the good from the bad, and I'd say, "Do you want to see some of the good letters?" Because I trashed the bad ones. And he'd say, "I don't want to see the good and I don't want to see the bad, just do your job." And I've taken that on board with social media now as well, because viewers no longer think you're like this character on the TV screen. They think they know you and they can get access to you on social media. So they write to you quite personally on social media and threaten you. So I don't read anything.
Can I tell you that does not happen in business news? But that's good, maybe.
No one gets upset with you about the markets.
No, not really. I don't have anything to do with the stock of NVIDIA. Anyways, let's move on, because Gaza, Israel is not the only conflict out there. You know, a couple of years ago, August 21, we watched in horror as the events unfolded in Afghanistan. It is a country very close to your heart. You were born there, and you reported extensively on the story. And then we worried a lot about Ukraine in the year of 2022. And all these conflicts, obviously, they're gut-wrenching, they're heartbreaking. But in a way, do we lose compassion once the spotlight moves to the next conflict?
And my God, doesn't the spotlight move quickly from one conflict to the other? I remember phrases like, and we still use it, the forgotten war, Yemen, Sudan, the forgotten war. Sudan is perhaps the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now. 1 million people are on the move. People are dying from starvation, and yet it wouldn't be seen on your TV screens because we seem to be fixated on certain conflicts and not the other. The Afghans were complaining to me that Ukraine has started, so they've forgotten about us. The Ukrainians are now complaining the Middle East has happened, so they've forgotten about us. We as the media do become quite fickle, and we chase things, and we're reactive in terms of one story and not the other. I make half-an-hour documentaries as well, and I try and focus on stories behind the headlines. So I have spoken to ISIS leaders in Iraq. I've spoken to the Taliban. I've covered the war in Yemen, in South Sudan. I've looked at the issues in the Philippines. I've looked at drug cartels in Mexico, because I try and go behind the headlines. It's a question of captivating the attention, if we can, of the audience. And I often also say that we underestimate the snowflakes, Gen Z, or before that, Gen Y and the millennials. It's almost like we make everything in short, sharp snippets like TikTok because we think that's where their attention span is. But actually, they're interested in long reads. They're interested in 1-hour documentaries.
Are they really? Are they really? Because, the world of television, it has changed so much. Viewership is slipping, no matter which channel. Well, hopefully someone watches TV.
I hope so.
Otherwise, a lot of people are out of their jobs. But of course we want to reach the younger generation. And I feel like we have to do that through the snippets that you're talking about on social media. Can we still have an impact with TV?
I think we can. I mean, look at the conflict in the Middle East, right? And this is the digital generation who are being educated through socials. Then they go looking. They go looking for those longer documentaries. They want to be educated. They want to understand. If we dismiss and say, they don't want to learn, they don't want to know, we have to be able to capture their imagination first. Then we educate them, right? But I do often question our education system. It was D-Day yesterday, and there was all the European leaders gathered in Normandy to celebrate the moment in which the things like freedom, liberty, democracy was achieved by these young men who fought for those things. And yet today, if you ask a young person about D-Day, they won't know what it is. They won't understand how the values. My family fled Afghanistan to have freedom so that I could have an education. Young girls in Afghanistan today, it's almost 1,000 days since they were last allowed in school. Imagine 1,000 days since a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old was allowed to go back to school because the Taliban have taken them back into the dark ages. We mustn't take education, civilization for granted. We mustn't assume that it is something that happens over there. It happened on the shores of Europe, and it can happen again if we're not careful. And we need to understand how we got to this moment.
Can we stay with Afghanistan for a moment here? Because August 21, it was a big shock to the world and a real embarrassment for the Western powers as the Taliban came back in and took Kabul. Do you get a sense that the Western world has failed your native country?
I don't know if I should joke, but the United States and Western allies fought in Afghanistan for 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Ultimately, we went through a 20-year process. All these things were achieved in that it was an insecure situation, of course, but we've gone from replacing the Taliban with the Taliban back to the Stone Ages. And I just wonder, what was the reason behind it? And I guess it's a combination of two things. Yes, there was abandonment and betrayal. The keys of Kabul were handed back to the Taliban, and Afghan women were let down by the West. But I also think the Afghan people needed to take responsibility. Billions of dollars were poured into that country, and they should have taken what they could have with the money and the attention that was there on the country over 20 years, and not failed themselves, and not assumed that someone was going to come back and rescue them, or that someone was going to be there forever, namely the United States and the West. Because when they left, they left. And here we are, where Afghan girls have been taken back into the Dark Ages.
Do you have hope for Afghanistan, for the young girls and the women who want to go to school and university? And I know you've also set up a foundation for girls and young women in Afghanistan, but right now, nothing is moving in terms of letting them go back to school.
You know, I don't want to say whenever I ask people, do you have hope as a journalist? Because I'm always on the other side as well, Caroline, so it's odd for me to be on this side. And people often say, oh, I'm the ultimate optimist. And I've seen a lot of bad things in the world. So I'm not optimistic, but I do have hope that history doesn't always remain the same. And things move and things change. And even within history, historic things happen. Do I think Afghan girls will eventually go back to school? Yeah, I think they'll eventually go back to school. But there will be a very dark period in that country's history, like we saw in the 90s. And I guess the other question is, do they want to go to school? Are there secret schools at the moment where they are, smuggling themselves into secret schools, underground schools, which I've seen? So that's what gives me hope, that they remain optimistic for their future, even though they've been let down and betrayed.
All right, let me do another journalist question. Do you have hope, not for Afghanistan this time, for the media landscape? We talked about this before. Obviously, everything is moving online, and you have a 5-year-old son. What if he says, hey, Mom, I want to be a journalist? Do you see a future for journalism as such? There's a big debate here in Switzerland about cutting some of the funding for the state broadcaster. How does the media landscape need to evolve to stay relevant?
I used to find, and I know there's been a lot of speakers here who've spoken about cyber and AI. I used to find it really terrifying. But I guess, listening to some of the speakers here combine things like humanity and artificial intelligence. Perhaps he might be a journalist, but there might be an AI version of him in the metaverse. And perhaps we need to be open to that. But if we go back to D-Day yesterday and what happened 80 years ago, those moments were documented. The sacrifices that were made were documented by journalists. We understand what happened then because we, as people on the front row of history, are documenting these things. We're on that train and we take the audience with us on that journey. So will it evolve? Yes, of course it'll evolve. Has it already evolved from when I told you that we had tape and letters rather than social media in my lifetime, in the course of my career from when I was 20 to a 40-year-old woman now? In the course of the last 20 years, the media landscape has changed astronomically. There isn't that appointment to view anymore. But will it change again for my son in 20 years' time if he chooses to be a journalist? Absolutely. I think we just need to embrace the change rather than fight it.
Mm-hmm. We've got 30 seconds on the clock. You know this. When someone tells you this, you got to keep it short. So I'll keep it short. I said in the intro, she's fearless. Are you fearless? You have a son, you have parents, you have family, you have friends. When you're in these really dangerous places, are you really fearless?
I have a responsibility. I wouldn't say I'm fearless. I'm not a storm chaser. I don't go after the guns and the front lines. But I have a responsibility because I have a platform, and I'd like to give voice to the voiceless.
Yalda, it is such a pleasure to be able to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.